There is documentation that Saint-Germain returned to France in 1788 and went about trying to warn the monarchy about what was coming. And it's a fascinating, dramatic, and harrowing account, which we will get into very soon. The present article, I'm not sure if we'll go through the whole thing. We're only on page 6 out of 20. I just wanted to give a little background. And we ended last time on a note of peace, I think, when I was noting that for me, or implying that for me, the avoidance of bloodshed is most important. We see the unfortunate, later on in the French Revolution, 1793, 94, 1792 to 94, we see it descend into a not only bloodshed, but a situation where people are applauding the bloodshed, and there's a kind of frenzy that to me resembles a form of psychosis. And when we look at what's happening in the United States with the riots, we see increasingly how people can be triggered and led into the most barbaric forms of behavior and kind of allowing their most primitive and terrible aspects to dominate every other aspect of themselves. And it's very disconcerting, to say the least, the images that have been coming out of the United States, and to see that this senseless, barbaric violence on the part of groups that remind me very much of the Jacobins, groups that are funded by stateless interests, bankers, probably the same gang that went about creating the terror in the French Revolution. We see them funding and winding up these agents in the United States. 99.9% of them probably have no idea what is behind their own impulses. But this is the sad part about humanity, that they can be so easily led to behave in ways that are absolutely abominable. And they can be triggered and led step by step to behaving in ways that, I can say 20 years ago, what's happening in the United States now would have been unthinkable. Because whatever differences people may have felt politically, there was a general consensus that at the end of the day, we all put aside our differences and get behind things like the rule of law and our basic freedoms. We see in the United States that this bedrock of what we felt was American has cracked open, has split, and there's all sorts of stuff spewing up out of the ground, and people have completely lost their minds. We see perhaps as we in maybe the next episode or the next after that, perhaps we get back into Saint-Germain, we see that he, I think, saw that this was coming, felt it, and tried to warn. But what he was attempting to warn the monarchy about was too horrible for them to consider, and they preferred to sort of put him off and sort of say, hey, you know, you're upsetting us here. We don't really want to hear about this right now. We're not in the mood. And we can't believe it. And generally, or at least among that small court circle, there was a feeling that there was, of course, great respect for Saint-Germain and astonishment at his appearance, his sudden appearance at that time, which is 4 years after his supposed death. But generally, he was not, I would say, not well received. He was putting people off and offending people by trying to warn them. So let's jump back now into this EIR article. Without bloodshed. Up until then, France had been governed by an absolute monarchy. The constitutional monarchy was restricting the powers of the king by a national representation under a constitution. However, this was also the most difficult page to turn in all of the history of France, because only a few people understood that this was a crucial axiomatic change. The discovery that Bailly made here was that the only legitimate government was a representative government. That is, in the spirit of a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Now, to me, this does not exclude a monarchy necessarily. And I'm beginning to suspect that there was a plot to unseat or to dislodge monarchs in general, because monarchs get in the way of the plans of certain international banking interests to exploit and control populations. So if you get the monarchs out of the way, you can just swoop right in, and people are fairly easy to control, as we see playing out all over the world. We see people behaving in the most irrational fashion without even bothering to question the ridiculous edicts of the unelected technocratic class that has taken control of economies and social discourse and media, and has managed to become so powerful that it has largely been immune from general criticism or even free discussion. That's just my view, and I think Saint-Germain, being an aristocrat, was not likely to be swept up in any kind of republican fervor. He was probably more pragmatic than that, and probably had a great deal of respect for the Bourbons. So, the alternative, here moving on, the alternative was a British-style parliamentary monarchy in which the nobility would keep its privilege, as the case of the House of Lords shows for England. That was the option of Necker and Orléans. The problem was so acute that any other form of government outside a constitutional monarchy would have been a usurpation of power. This is what Bailly meant by the national regeneration, in which representatives served the people as opposed to ruling the people. Here, Bailly spoke of the momentous decisions, voluntary abdication of privileges of the nobility that the National Assembly decreed on 17th of June, 1789, from which the privilege of the nobility disserving the kingdom was transformed into a noble privilege of serving the nation state, which I think is completely consistent with the exemplary form of monarchy, which does exist and can exist and has existed. Let's see. It was voted on this day that the National Assembly intends and decrees that all tax collections and contributions of all sorts, which have not been formally and freely decided by the Assembly, will cease to exist in all the provinces of the kingdom, whatever their administrative form may be. The Assembly further declares, in concert with His Majesty, that as soon as the principles of national regeneration shall be established, it will take care of examining and consolidating the public debt. Finally, the Assembly, becoming active, recognizes also that it owes its first moments to the examination of the causes which have produced in the provinces of the kingdom the famine that has afflicted them, and to the pursuit of the means of alleviating that in the most prompt and effective way possible. And consequently, it has decided to name a committee to be in charge of that important object, and that His Majesty shall be entreated to supply this committee with all the necessary information. The present deliberation shall be printed and sent to all the provinces. So, as I suspect that the famine and the financial collapse were something that were dirty deeds done from beyond the borders of France, and perhaps by some agents within France. I think probably there were people working against the monarchy to create these dreadful, dreadful emergencies, and because I've just seen it in too many other places. Famines are almost uniformly events that are caused by the worst actors on the stage of humanity at any given point, in my experience. They are not natural occurrences. The decision to publish the decrees of the National Assembly and circulate them immediately as leaflets made the declarations not only public and binding nationwide, but also played an enlightening role for the uneducated mass of people. This had the electrifying effect of elevating the people, as had the published ordinances of Louis XI in the 15th century, in establishing France as the first nation state. So there's nothing new here. We can look back to Louis XI as an enlightened monarch who created the first nation state of France, which was technically a monarchy, but he granted the people rights and freedoms and dignity. And this was his project. And I would say that this was systematically sabotaged almost as soon as it was largely achieved. I think the certain people couldn't allow this to happen because the germ of this sense of personal freedoms and dignity granted to the people through an enlightened monarch was something that could not be allowed. To this end, Baye was attempting to solve two crucial problems at once. One was to stop at all cost the famine and the financial collapse, and the other was to establish the rights of the Assembly and of the king. It is for that reason that the Assembly included the monarch Louis XVI as a representative in its legislative deliberations and decisions. After long debates, the plan of the old Committee for the Constitution was adopted without reservation by the three orders forming the Estates General. The Sovereign Assembly decreed on 22nd of September 1789, "The French government is a monarchy. There is no higher authority outside of this law. The king reigns according to it, and it is only by virtue of this law that he can demand obedience. No act of the legislative body can be recognized as law unless it has been established by the representatives of the nation, freely and legally elected and ratified by the monarch." Very interesting. In a sense, it's a document that binds the monarch or recognizes the natural bond between a monarch and the people, a reciprocity, a bond. an admission that the king has a duty and that he serves. And I think that's a very beautiful thing, and I think Saint-Germain would have felt so also. Going on, by integrating the monarchy into a constitutional framework of the representation of the nation, the National Assembly was guaranteeing that the authority of the king could only be obeyed within this new law and that his powers were no longer absolute. The actions of king had become restrained by the will of the nation. And I should like to look back and see if perhaps this was something that Louis XI didn't intuitively feel and pledge himself to, because the sentiment behind it, I think, is a beautiful thing. And an enlightened monarch needn't feel restrained by his role as a servant and by the will of the people, which he should ideally work with and for and from. Then we have, let's go on, we're getting into something that I think is certainly pertinent today and is being absolutely it's being overturned now in a kind of definitive way all over the planet. We will see dominoes falling, you know. The Federal Reserve in the United States, Trump has now put it under the control of the Treasury. He is now controlling the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is basically powerless at this point, and it must serve the people. So we see, let's say, tackling the debt problem. From 1783 to 1789, the British free trade policy was imposed on France. You see, here we have it, and had destroyed its economy. British free trade. And I know in the 19th century, free trade, see, we think of it now as something wonderful. It sounds so good, doesn't it? It's almost like euphemism. Free trade, it sounds so lofty and in the best spirit of capitalism, if you can abide such a thing, such a concept. But back, you know, even in the 19th century, it was understood when you said free trade, you were talking about British imperialism. You were talking about something that was opposed to the American system, which emphasized the development of the nation and progress through building up an economy like the railroads and the steel industry, and that nations should be empowered within themselves, and then they may join in partnerships with other nations working together. This was something that was later taken up by John F. Kennedy, in fact. But in the 19th century, it was understood that free trade was not a good thing. And so back to where we are here. The treasury was empty, and the agents of the Duc d'Orléans were spreading the rumor that the kingdom was about to declare bankruptcy. And isn't it interesting? Sometimes all you have to do is spread the rumor, and you can cause chaos. This would not have been so surprising when the richest prince in all of Europe, the Duc d'Orléans, paid less than £40,000 in taxes a year. In June 1789, Bailly saw that the issue of the public debt had become the most urgent question to resolve. He wrote, "Even though this public debt did not interest the people directly, the question of bankruptcy was about to create a general reversal of fortunes which would have shaken the entire kingdom, so it was necessary to rapidly dissipate any fear in this respect and secure public credit." The act of consolidating the debt was not just a solemn act of justice for the general welfare at all, but was a question of honor and of legitimacy that the National Assembly could not leave to anyone else. This was a crucial test of strength for the newly formed assembly. Baye was preparing the assembly to declare an orderly reorganization of the public debt. That is, the equivalent of a Chapter 11 debt reorganization, canceling the illegitimate debt while maintaining the crucial national institutions open and functioning. I see that economics is not my strong suit at all, but it seems it's kind of describing something similar to what the U.S. is going through, but slightly different terms. It seems like it's a transition away from a debt-based economy into an economy based on actual production and maybe sound money. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm probably way off on this. The difficulty, however, was that the assembly had to give itself the legitimate authority which up until then had only resided in the king. Furthermore, this act of sovereignty could not be construed to be a usurpation of the king's prerogative. Quite to the contrary, the nation had to come of age and had to take hold of its inalienable rights legitimately. Baye himself noted that the use of such words as the assembly intends or decrees and so forth reflected the authority of a sovereign language by which the National Assembly began to declare the will of the nation. She intends by her constitution and she decrees by her sovereignty, he commented. Meanwhile, Jacques Necker at the Ministry of Finance, in an unholy alliance with the Duc d'Orléans, here we go, was ready to cause the greatest possible chaos and confusion. We see this has happened recently in the United States, where they're trying to tell us that the economy is going to crash, that it's hopeless, that the Great Recession is coming, and a depression that's going to make the depression of the 1930s look like a Tea Party, and oh my God, this direct parallel, rather alarming, to say the least. One, by creating a famine and declaring the bankruptcy of France. Well, we saw this recently with them warning us that, oh my God, because of COVID-19, there's not going to be any meat delivery, the beef industry, it's all going to go down the tubes, be ready for shortages. Absolutely terrifying to hear this kind of nonsense. Needless, destructive rumors, and worse than rumors, I'm sure they would really have loved it if they could have achieved it. But they are being opposed. Back in these days, the gang ran riot. There was no stopping them. Today, it's a little different. We have Trump and his team. But Louis XVI was, I think, rather confused, hapless, unaided. Moving on. 2, by eliminating the National Assembly. 3, by militarizing Paris and crowning the Jacobin King Philippe Égalité, Duc d'Orléans. Eliminating the National Assembly, which represents the voice of reason. And in the United States, the voice of reason is under attack. They would very much like to silence it, absolutely. Militarizing Paris. Well, they're using militantism these days to try to create a situation that feels almost paramilitary. They're creating a situation that is militaristic in nature, in that people are faced with existential fears, as happened in Seattle. You know, where people in a city can be moved in upon by these sort of Jacobin horde, these gangs, and create a situation that either requires the military or actually very much resembles a kind of paramilitary incursion, similar to what we've seen in Central America. But anyway, four, by getting himself named prime minister under a British parliamentary system that he was openly advocating. It was for that purpose that the Jacobin cult was created and the Bastille coup d'etat organized. A Jacobin cult. And I can't think of, when you look at these artificial organizations running riot in the United States, it's hard not to see them as wings of a single cult. People can blame George Soros, but believe me, there are people behind George Soros. Some people are waking up that they are under the influence of a cult that is largely defining the terms and putting the symbols into place and hoping to knock down the symbols of, or so-called symbols. They're trying to bash history. They're trying to trash history. And just like the burning of the Notre Dame, the arson of Notre Dame, the impulse behind it is quite similar, let's say, the impulse behind it is identical. The rioters, the people going nuts, the thugs, the psychotic, lunatic zombies that are doing that are tearing down statues, they think it's about racism. They are the dupes of some very clever people. Very clever indeed. And as with most cults, the people at the bottom don't really know what's going on. Their passions have been tapped into, they've been wound up and set loose, and they don't know why they're doing it. They think they know. They think that their thoughts are their own. They think they understand the debate. Let's see, how are we on time? All right. Let's wrap this up pretty soon. 2, why the king was needed for the regeneration of the nation. In order to understand this period of French history and recognize its significance for today's world, it is essential to emphasize, and this is 2002, this was written, it is essential to emphasize that the French Revolution was not necessary and that all French schoolchildren should have been taught that Louis XVI was in agreement with the principles of the American Revolution, was constantly seeking ways to show his love for the French people, and that, more than once, his tragic timidity would prevail over his desire to demonstrate his affection and to assert the truth of the American Revolution. Louis XVI was a kindly but weak king. Bailly says of him, "Despotism never entered into the character of the king. He only desired the happiness of his people, the which was the only means of seducing him. And if ever he was pushed into some act of authority, it was either because he was convinced that some good would come of it, or some ill was to be avoided. And that was done within the perspective of soothing the pain of the nation for the prosperity of the empire and the happiness of all. I remain convinced that he has always considered his authority and the need to maintain it merely as a caution and as the basis for tranquility and for internal peace." Since we are talking about the causes of the regeneration, let us say that the first cause is found in the character of Louis XVI himself. This king could not have displayed more goodness than he did. But if he had been advised by better ministers, there would not have been a revolution. Bailly wanted Louis XVI to follow in the footsteps of his great predecessors, Louis XI and Henry IV. On the extraordinary occasion of becoming mayor of Paris, Baye welcomed the king and gave him the keys of the city with these words, I bring to your majesty the keys of your good city of Paris. These are the same keys which were presented to Henry IV. He had recovered his people. Now the people have recovered their king. Baye constantly looked for ways to win the king over to the Leibnizian idea of the common good. Let's stop there. I think that's a very interesting point to contemplate. What was the impulse in the heart of Louis XI to create the first nation state in which people were granted dignity and possibility? Let's look into it. I'm not sure if it will fit well into this whole Saint-Germain project, but it's something to look into. And because I have a feeling that Saint-Germain was defending this impulse on which I think resides in any legitimate enlightened monarch. So anyway, I'll get back to you soon. Hope everybody's doing well.